In this episode, we talk about a recent suicide case that surfaced in one of Delhi's most prominent schools and how school counselors are helping children cope with increasingly complex emotions and social pressures. We also talk about the controversy around Congress MP Shashi Tharoor's refusal to accept an award. But we begin today by talking about the fall of the rupee and the reason it might be an actual cause for concern this time. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last week, for the first time ever, the Indian rupee slipped below the critical 90 per dollar level, closing at around 89.4. This means that now $1 costs less than 90 rupees. This breach jolted financial markets and amplified concerns about the broader economic landscape, especially since the rupee has already lost more than 5% this calendar year. Now the rupee has weakened against the dollar before as well. So what's different this time? Is it simply that the 90 mark carries psychological weight, or does this slide signal something much bigger? To understand that, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Udit Misra.
Udit, every once in a while we hear news headlines talking about how the rupee has depreciated against the dollar, how it has weakened, and we've been hearing these stories for years now. Is there anything different about it this time around?
Okay, so there are two things that are different about this time. One is obviously that the sharpness of the fall has caught everybody's attention, by which I mean that rupee has fallen far more in a short period of time, as against what is expected of rupee, that it will depreciate a bit versus the dollar every year. And the second thing is, you may recall that, sometime back when the rupee was falling and the rupee had hit, I think, around 80, the finance minister had said that, it is not the rupee that is weakening, it is the dollar that is strengthening. And so what stands out this time is that it's actually the dollar which is weakening, and all other currencies have strengthened against the dollar, and the rupee is still weakening, right? So it is flipping that whole argument that rupee is weakening even when the dollar is weakening. So those are the two reasons why it has caught everybody's attention.
And in the past, we've talked about how one of the main things that affects the value of a rupee is demand and supply. If more people are demanding the dollar, then the dollar is the one that's going to be stronger. And that is the case with India as well. We purchase a lot of things in dollars. Crude oil, for example. India is one of the biggest buyers of crude oil, and that we buy in dollars. So it makes sense that the dollar is much stronger than the rupee. But what's interesting this time is that the rupee, like you said, is weakening when a similar thing is happening to the dollar as well. So why is it that the rupee has weakened simultaneously as opposed to so many other currencies?
So therein we look at two other separate reasons, that even when the dollar is weakening, why is the rupee weakening? And therein we realize that of all the other countries, India has actually been singled out by President Donald Trump for very high levels of tariff. So the same argument that, we demand more dollars because our trade imbalance is there gets accentuated because there are more tariffs, our goods will not be demanded as much. And again, the demand for rupee falls and the demand for more dollars rises. And so that is one reason why rupee gets singled out, because we are facing more tariffs. The second is that the trade deal between India and US has not yet been finalized. So that uncertainty adds to that tariff pressure, that not only are we facing higher tariffs, but there is continuing uncertainty that this may carry on for a longer period, right? So people, when you're hedging your positions in the foreign exchange market, you suspect that rupee will continue to weaken, right? And then yet another reason is that regardless of what has happened on our GDP front, GDP growth front, which is very rosy on the face of it, the fact is that our companies are not making as much profit, and this is borne by data. And because companies are not making as much profit, investors are not buying their stocks or investing in India. Foreign investors are not doing that. So they're not bringing a lot of capital from outside India.
So that's another way that people are not demanding the rupee, and hence the fall.
Exactly. So, typically the old story about India was that we had a trade deficit, or also something related was the current account deficit, which basically meant that we used to import more than we exported in dollar terms. And that deficit was papered over typically by the fact that everybody invested a lot of money in India. So we had a surplus on that capital account, so-called capital account. People investing in India, either through foreign direct investment, coming and setting up a factory here, right? Or foreign portfolio investment, which is coming and buying stocks from Indian companies. So money came in and that surplus sort of softened the blow. But what has happened now is not just the problem on the trade front, which is worsened by tariffs, but also the fact that people have pulled out money from India. Actually, one of the things that I wrote in one of the pieces that I wrote for Indian Express last week, I showed that even Indian companies are now investing more outside India, So the FDI, the foreign direct investment out of India has just skyrocketed. And so the net FDI, the money coming in and the net effect of money coming in and money going out on foreign direct investment has turned negative. So actually on the net result, more money is going out of India on the capital side also. So all of these factors have just, created this situation where the rupee's value is falling versus the dollar.
And Udit, when the rupee weakens against the dollar, of course, importing things becomes more expensive, right? Because it's costlier to buy things in dollars now. But at the same time, people say that this helps exports because now when people want to buy things in rupees, it's cheaper for them. So is that really the case? Does it actually help Indian exporters?
So on paper, if you were an exporter, if suppose I was an exporter making use of everything within India and creating a product and then exporting it, then a rupee's exchange rate weakening helps me. Why? Because my product now becomes cheaper for the foreigner and they buy more of it, right? However, in India's case, it is not terribly clear whether a weakening rupee necessarily helps exporters because a lot of our exports require intermediate imports, which is to say that what we export requires first for us to import something. For example, gems and jewelry, this is a sector which is very high value exports, because everything is valued very highly. But what we don't often realize is that when we suppose make a jewelry piece and export it, we might have actually imported the gems. We might have imported the gold. So a lot of that export really is part of the import also. So when your rupee weakens, what helps you in export also makes it more costly for you to import things. So the net result for a country like India is not terribly easy to understand. Even the experts are divided whether necessarily a weaker rupee is good for our exports or not. So that is one thing. And the second thing is that, and people should understand because, these stories have been doing rounds about India's need for deregulation, more reforms. We've just had labor law reforms. Any country's exports don't depend just on the value of that currency. It also depends on other factors and perhaps more critically depend on other factors like the efficiency of your economy, whether you can produce things in an efficient manner.
Right, just because Udit is selling something for really cheap doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to buy it.
Exactly. I mean, we can see this in so many products. China is a good example. Maybe now it's more of a stereotype than the truth. Maybe China is bringing out much better quality products. But, in the past, this was the notion that, China would create a knockoff of something that was very high quality in Western Europe or US. And then you will buy that primarily because it is cheaper. But you always realize that it was not the real thing, right? So if you wanted to buy something of really good quality, you would always go back to the European product. So, improving the efficiency of your economy, the quality of your economy is far more important. And part of that is also to bring down cost. As I mentioned in so many places that, the travel costs, the logistical costs in India are pretty high, right? Even the cost of living, when we talk about pollution or too much traffic, taking time away from things. These are all things that are adding to those elements. So yeah, I mean, that factor also matters. It's not just about whether your rupee, like if you cannot, for argument's sake, think that if the rupee was to fall from, say, 90 today to 200, all of a sudden everything will be great. That was the only thing that was required for India to become a giant economy. We can't produce everything because we don't actually produce all those things. We don't know necessarily how to produce all the things in the most efficient and high quality manner.
Also, Udit, right now we are talking about the rupee falling in purely economic terms. But often, the rupee depreciating is talked about in a way that it somehow represents how strong or how weak India is as a nation. And political parties often talk about it like this. And for a lot of people, the rupee falling does puncture their idea of India's overall growth story. So, how much of the rupee falling should people see in those terms?
So there are two parts that need to be talked about. One is that there is over politicization of the rupee's exchange rate value. And I think it started off with this government more so. And that is why I think the opposition today leaves no opportunity that every time rupee falls, they want to, raise this issue. Primarily because the incumbent prime minister had made these similar points when he was outside the government. But this is over politicization. The value of rupee, as I mentioned, rupee will depreciate versus the dollar. If for nothing else, then for the simple factor that we have more inflation in our economy than the US. Over a longer term, we have 4% inflation every year. They have 2% inflation. So basically our currency is losing value faster than their currency is losing value. So typically our currency should depreciate versus theirs.
And that's a good thing because we need to grow a lot faster than they do.
Exactly, right? And so one is the politicization bit. The other is understanding bit about the traditional understanding was that the currency was stronger for a country which was producing a lot of goods and everybody was buying those goods, right? And Western Europe, Japan, US. But China's rise has shown that you could have a weaker currency, right? And there have been arguments that China kept its currency weak in an artificial manner. But a weaker currency could also create a very strong economy because, you then take over the markets of the world because you're a weaker currency, often artificially, manipulating your currency. Under normal circumstances, China's currency should appreciate. There's a lot of documented evidence that China does keep its currency weaker. Now, for India, is it necessarily good to have a strong currency? One has to understand what is the horse and what is the cart here. The horse is economic output and productivity. That has to come first. Once that happens, then if your currency becomes strong as a result, that makes sense. But you cannot artificially bump up your currency and think that by itself will make our economy stronger, right? So this is, again, if you were to depoliticize the whole issue, then you will just see this as just an economic variable reacting to the trade and capital flows. You will not sort of take it very emotionally. But right now, it has become a terribly emotional issue. And that's a wrong thing. And I think most of our listeners should understand that this is not the way. Even if this has been happening for more than a decade, we should give up this bad habit of sort of looking at rupee's value and thinking very emotionally about it. There are problems with a sharper fall, because that ruins a lot of things. If suppose I was going there as a student and all of a sudden the rupee fell by 5 rupees, then all my budget goes awry. If I was an exporter or importer, those things can ruin a business. And it's difficult to make policy, monetary policy, everything. But by itself, as a broader thing, the rupee weakening is just a fact of life. Following real economics, we should focus our attention more on the real economy and how to improve there. And other things will, all those other ducks will come in the row by themselves.
Yeah, because even if, say, tomorrow 1 rupee suddenly equaled $1, that won't exactly be good for India, right? In fact, it would negatively impact us because instantly all our goods would become more expensive for the rest of the world.
Yes. Firstly, if you do that, it will actually hit you more because your exports will get hit to that extent. As I said, this is not very clear how it will impact, but, just as we argue on paper, it will help us. On paper, this would hit us. But the other thing is that if something is artificial, then the large players in the market, in the forex market, can actually play you. I mean, George Soros' claim to fame is that he actually realized that the British currency was not fairly valued and bet accordingly and actually made millions. That's how he did it. So you cannot artificially just inflate the value of a currency because then other players can come into the market and bet against it. And because your story doesn't have any legs, and sooner or later it will fall, they'll make money and you will have a lot of losses on your books. So it really doesn't work that way in the interconnected world. You could have done that when you were a closed economy. When you didn't export or import anything, then you could have said that my currency is this, right? When you come in, give me $10 and I will give you 1 rupee, right? When you were not buying anything from the rest of the world.
Right, saying that I don't need anyone, so I'll decide what my currency is worth.
Yes, if you are not buying a single thing from the rest of the world, then you could close your doors and say that, okay, if you come inside, I will take 10 of your dollars before I give you 1 rupee, right? But if you're doing those trades openly, and not just you, it's not just the RBI governor single-handedly doing it or the government single-handedly doing it. It's all of us buying and selling stuff. When I order a fountain pen from US or Japan, I'm doing that trade because I'm then shelling out, say 10,000 rupees from my pocket to buy the required number of yen or dollars, right? And that trade is not controlled by anybody. So in an open economy, it's not feasible. It cannot happen.
And next, we look at how school counselors are helping children cope with increasingly complex emotions and social pressures. Last month, one of Delhi's most prominent schools came under the spotlight after a class 10 student died by suicide. This was the St. Columbus School, and the incident had sparked protests across the city after the boy's parents alleged that the 16-year-old had faced repeated humiliation and threats from teachers at school. Now, in the aftermath, the Indian Express reached out to counselors in several leading schools across the capital to understand the kind of pressures children are dealing with today.
So what emerged was a very stark, very troubling picture of the kind of emotional distress teenagers are carrying today.
That's the Indian Express's Vidheesha Kuntamalla, who reported on this story for the paper.
The St. Columbus incident was not an isolated tragedy. There have been incidents which occurred last month in other states as well. For instance, there was a suicide of a student in Jaipur as well. And counselors that we spoke to described it as part of a much larger pattern of rising anxiety, earlier onset of depressive symptoms, and an increasing number of students who are struggling to cope.
In fact, one of the things that the counselors told Vidheesha was that a number of children are now resorting to self-harm in an attempt to curb unstoppable thoughts or even when they feel worthless.
So one counselor that we spoke to particularly described a 15-year-old who walked into her office wearing long sleeves in the Delhi heat and had disclosed that she had been hurting herself for months. So counselors said these cases existed earlier, but they were fewer in number. Now the number is increasing quite a bit. And what has changed is that most students are opening up. They use mental health vocabulary very fluently, like, words like panic attack or boundaries or dignity. These are words which are seen to be used today more than they were maybe a decade ago. And they come without masks into counseling rooms, very raw and very overwhelmed. So students today are in significant emotional distress, but they are also more willing to seek help.
So, Vidheesha, what are some of the reasons that children are resorting to such extreme measures and the reasons why they are under such extreme emotional distress?
So there isn't one figure. It's a mix of emotional, digital, and developmental factors. So some patterns that emerged in our conversations was, of course, first the digital overload. Children are spending more than 9 hours online and then coming to school, and they're very exhausted and very impulsive. There's an early exposure to adult content. Even primary schoolers are using sexually explicit phrases because they've picked them up from phones or OTT shows. There's this body image anxiety at younger ages. Of course, this did exist even a decade ago, but it seems to be growing even more these days. For instance, there was this one instance of an 8-year-old who wanted to lose 10 kilos, even though she was perfectly in shape because of the peer pressure around her in school. So there's that. And counselors have also expressed that there is massive confusion between teasing and bullying these days. Children don't understand gradation anymore, and conflicts escalate very quickly. And overwhelmingly, counselors also shared that children don't know how to express what they feel, so they act out what they see online.
And you also mentioned in your story that parents now feel that they don't have a sense of authority over their own children and that they feel scared that they might end up triggering them.
So there was this one case that one of the counselors had mentioned that, she often sees this parent who already himself is a teacher come up to her and say that, if we say anything to our child, they'll just lock themselves up in their room and they're very scared. What if they harm themselves? We are not able to take away their phone from them. So we need you to sort of jump in and do that for us. So this fear has created a kind of paralysis at home. Counselors said this is often the result of over-pampering. Overprotective parenting is emerging as a pattern these days, especially in nuclear families. Parents fulfilling every demand, avoiding boundaries, and now finding themselves unable to set limits. So there's also a post-pandemic shift to this. In the 2 years of isolation, the student-adult hierarchy has flattened. So children became very used to negotiating with adults as equals. So the traditional authority just doesn't work anymore like it used to work for kids like me back then when I was a student 10 years ago. There was always that sense of hierarchy between me and my teacher and me and my parent. That seems to be missing today.
And Vidheesha, how does overexposure to OTT platforms and AI chatbots like ChatGPT impact the kids?
So the effects of this are already emerging at a very young age on ground. So one of the counselors told me that about, a 14-year-old who had Googled every possible symptom before she walked in to her room and she had fully diagnosed her emotional profile. So that is the amount of access kids these days have to social media and to technology, where they can access every information without knowing whether it's good for them or bad for them. So today's children don't lack vocabulary. They're very overloaded with it. They come in saturated with information, but unclear about their own lived experiences. So it's about this wider trend of outsourcing emotional understanding to the internet. Counselors said the problem is not ignorance anymore. It's too many questions. It's too much exposure to too much information at a very young age.
Right. And you also write that in a lot of cases, the damage was done by the isolation or the lack of social interaction that happened during COVID. So what changes have the counselors seen in the students post-COVID-19?
So post-pandemic, the change has been dramatic. Counselors described a clear pre- and post-pandemic divide. So post-COVID, many children could not sit through a full day of school. They get very antsy, very agitated. They get very overwhelmed by peer interaction. Small conflicts escalated because they'd lost the muscle memory of social navigation. Some children engaged in self-harm behaviors like snapping rubber bands or punching walls. So there was this entire phenomenon of the blue whale effect, suicide effect a few years ago. So, of course, it's not like the wave, which is similar to the blue whale suicide effect per se, but you find kids copying online suicide game patterns these days. And there was grief. Many children had lost one or both parents due to COVID. So that emotional neglect also in some cases during isolation still shows up in their behavior today.
But Vidheesha, in the beginning you had mentioned that students have started going to the counselors and expressing what they're going through. So that's definitely a positive development, right?
Absolutely. I think it is the hopeful part of the story that, kids are trusting more in the system, coming forward and, visiting counselors and are open for help, which was not the case when I was a student 10 years ago. There was still that stigma of, reaching out for help. So counselors said that while distress is high, help seeking is also higher than ever, which is why more and more cases are coming forward because you're seeking for help. So that is bringing out more cases to attention. Children trust that counseling rooms are confidential and safe spaces. And also schools, I think, are becoming more and more sensitive in making it clear that confidentiality will be respected. So kids walk in saying they're having a panic attack or, my friend sat with someone else and I'm spiraling. So for all the challenges, the core of childhood remains unchanged. Children want a place where they won't be judged for failing, where their anger isn't punished, and, where they can speak loudly about their heartbreak. So yes, students showing up is positive and it's something schools must strengthen further. There is more work to be done in that area.
So, Vidhisha, what do counsellors say can be done to improve the situation for the students, both in school and at home?
Yeah, so from counselors to psychologists that we reached out to, we had reached out to an expert child psychologist. Her name is Dr. Bhavna Barni. So she had sort of laid down a guidebook for parents where she had mentioned a few clear recommendations. So for parents, she had suggested that reclaiming authority without fear would be best at a younger age. I mean, she says don't do this without through threats, but through consistent boundaries. She also suggests create collaborative digital rules. There need to be screen time limits at home. There need to be no phone zones, especially while you're having your meals. There should be no digital device around the child. There needs to be more open conversation about what they see online. These are all recommendations that she is giving to parents these days to navigate the upbringing of children with all the emotional stress factors around. She also says that encouraging emotional grounding, like everyday check-ins, really matter for more than grand interventions. You know, just a simple, how was your day? I understand why you're feeling like that today. And also very importantly, she suggests that we must allow our children to fail safely. We should not be the rescuers. The parents should not solve the problem for them. A scaffolding is necessary, but not all-time rescue.
And in the end, we talk about a political controversy involving Congress MP Shashi Tharoor, which broke out after he was named the recipient of the Veer Savarkar International Impact Award, which is given by HRDS India, an NGO that works on CSR and tribal development projects. Tharoor, however, said that he will not accept the award, and he learned about the award only from media reports. He also called it irresponsible on the part of the organizers to announce his name without his consent. However, when the Indian Express's Shaju Philip reached out to Aji Krishnan, the founder secretary of HRDS India, he disputed this and said the decision had been communicated a month earlier. Krishnan claimed that he and his team had met Tharoor at his home, briefed him about the award, and invited him to the ceremony. He said that jury chairman, retired IAS officer Ravi Kant, had also met Tharoor 2 weeks ago and discussed details of previous recipients. According to Krishnan, there was no objection then, and Tharoor had agreed to attend the event, adding that he had been chosen for his global credentials and his work representing India abroad. Now, this controversy is unfolding during a period of strain between the Congress leadership and Tharoor, and at a time when there are also rumors that he might join the BJP.
See, there's nothing concrete as such, but there have been certain overtures from the BJP and the government side also, which have resulted in these rumors.
That's the Indian Express's Asad Rahman, who reports on Congress for the paper.
And maybe it's just a ploy to, embarrass the Congress, or maybe it is a way to check if Mr. Shashi Tharoor is interested in joining the BJP. So I'll give you a few examples. Like when the Pahalgam attack happened in April this year, then the Congress had sent certain names to the government that these people should represent the government in their foreign delegations that were going abroad to put forward the stand of the Indian government and the nation itself. Then Mr. Tharoor's name was not in that list. But then when the government released the names, Tharoor was made the head of the delegation, probably the most important one, because his delegation was going to the US. So that was one of the things. Then there have been multiple incidents where, Tharoor has also done something or the government has done something. Most recently, Tharoor wrote a column on a digital platform where he criticized dynastic politics, and he said that the Gandhi family has cemented this idea of dynastic politics in the country. Now, this is a direct attack on the Gandhis and the Congress, and we all know how important the Gandhis are to the Congress party. So that was another thing. Then most recently, if you see, Tharoor was invited to the dinner being hosted by President Draupadi Murmu for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, both the LOPs in both houses of parliament, Mr. Rahul Gandhi and Mr. Mallikarjun Kharge, were not invited for this dinner, but Shashi Tharoor was. Now, we know that Shashi Tharoor is also the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on External Affairs. So that was what he said, that, as the Parliamentary Committee's chair, he was invited, and that the practice to invite the chair of the Parliamentary Committee had been discontinued, but it seems like it has been restarted. Now, both LOPs not being invited, a Congress MP being invited, did did raise eyebrows in the Congress came out with a statement saying that Tharoor, those who have been invited, are going on their own accord and are open to scrutiny. So definitely something is wrong in the relationship between the Congress and Shashi Tharoor. Several leaders off the record do tell us that, he's on the verge of joining the BJP or the High Command is not happy with him. But we have absolutely no confirmation on whether he will jump ship or he'll continue to stick around in the Congress.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Niharika, Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.